who delivers psychological services. It's the coach who delivers psychological services. And I think that we see the birth of this in Canada, this change in Canada with things like the Coaching Association of Canada, the level 1, 2, and 3, 4, 5 programs. But my sense of this is these concerns in this area need to develop very early in the athletic career. As a clinical psychologist working with athletes, the work that I do falls into two realms. One of them has to do with what I'll talk about tonight, which is really performance enhancement or psychological skills training. The second one is the thing that I should probably be doing more of, which is clinical intervention in athletics, which has to do with working with athletes and coaches when there's a real problem, when somebody's performance is being compromised by the problems of living, whether or not that's depression. For example, you take gymnastics today. Today in gymnastics we have a real problem with eating disorders because puberty is death to a female gymnast. If you want to reflect back on that, you think about the 12 and 13-year-olds that were competing in the Olympics in gymnastics. There weren't too many women there over about 15 years old. And so what we get in that sport are a tremendous number of young females who are essentially anorexic or certainly bulimic. In fact, I've heard gymnasts who have been counseled by their coaches to develop the strategy called chucking, which is what jockeys do to keep their weight down, which is essentially learning to vomit. These psychological issues, though, are very real, and this is probably what I feel I should be doing most of my time. I feel that the things that I'm talking about tonight are things that you should do, and I look forward to the day in Canadian sport when that's the situation. What I'm going to talk about, first of all, is try to provide a rationale for why I think that it's important that athletes invest in psychological training. Essentially, my frustration stems from the lip service that's given to the recognition that when we recognize that when technical and physical preparation is in place, it all comes down to the mental or the psychological. And in fact, at the high performance level, we make an assumption. The irony is that when an athlete has attained a high level of technical and physical preparation or competency and yet is frustrated at the elite level, which is a very common experience for Canadian athletes, we tell them that it's all mental. We turn around then and say, but the thing is that at your level of competition, it's all mental. My sense of it is that we've done our athlete a great disservice. We've set them up, we've created expectations which in fact are not real. And I believe that in this country, at the present time, we can provide technical and physical training probably as well as any other country in the world. That would be my sense of it in most sports. So really then what we do is we let our athletes down psychologically. It's interesting that Paul Martini, after winning the World Championships, questioned why is it that a Soviet skater, someone we've never heard of before, comes out in their very first year and places in the medals, someone we've never heard of. Whereas a Canadian skater, an Orser or Martini, somebody like that, spends 5 or 6 years at the international level before they can cope with the stress of international competition to become the athlete that they should be. His sense of what he's saying quite simply is that it's more to do with psychological than mental or technical. And let me just say, as I make my first very detailed diagram, that this looks tremendously sophisticated, but it's not. What this says here is that I view performance, which is essentially outcome, that's the bottom line, how effective somebody is, as a relationship between mental or psychological training and technical and physical. And I see these two as being very closely intertwined. My concern here is to say quite simply that it's not that these two are not important. They are infinitely important. But my point is that they are assumptions, that they are givens. As people become better and better in athletics, and in fact even within the context of sport in the developmental sense, because sport is usually defined along age groups or weight categories or something like that. So you have people who have essentially within any given sport technical and physical limitations imposed upon them, so that there's very little variance. If you talk about it in a statistical sense, there's very little variance in this area. What is technical training? Technical training is the history of sport. It's the history of sport development. Periodically, there are big breakthroughs in the technical realm. Someone invents a fiberglass pole for pole vaulting. Someone invents an oversized tennis racket for tennis. Someone invents a nylon shoe for running. There are periodically technical breakthroughs, and sports go through some sort of a revolution at that time, because people have to decide whether or not that new innovation will be accepted or whether or not it will be outlawed. For example, in racing car, last year the McLaren Hondas totally dominated racing car, and they were turboed engines. This year, the turboed engines are not being allowed because that's the way that sports will regulate the turboed engine. They just won't allow people in Formula One to have turbo engines. The physical side of it, my sense of it is the physical side of it is where sport is at in its development right now, in sort of talking about the last 10, 15 years. That people have focused more and more attention on their physical training. I mean, 15 years ago, athletes used to make a joke about the kinds of foods they ate before they competed. Now people take it very seriously. 15 years ago, I used to laugh at tennis players that did stretching exercises. Now I take it very seriously. So that this side, this part of it then is becoming less and less of contributing variance to the outcome. It's become more and more of a given. My concern then is that what we continue to do, despite the fact that this is an assumption, is that this is where we spend all of our time. We spend all of our time training people technically and physically and assuming that this side will somehow get dragged along. And my sense of it is that just doesn't happen. It just doesn't happen. I pulled a quote for Vic recently, and it's become one of his favorites. It is the quote by Napoleon, that in war, the mental is to the physical as 100 to 1. But if you look in sports, you can get in any sport, you can get athletes who will make that kind of description. I think about a hard-nosed hockey player like John Tonelli, who comes along and says, once you get to the professional level, it's 90% mental. Okay, now that's a guy who, for many people, would think that his big thing in sport is to be physical. Jimmy Connors talks about tennis as being at the professional level 95% mental and 15% technical. Now he's allowing, by the way, that at the local level here in the Nelson Tennis Club, that it drops to 90-10. Okay, and all of you know that. All of you know that. All of you know that. If you think about that, go watch the finals of the Club C singles sometimes. You'll see friendship ends. Friendships that are long-last friendships will be destroyed because both of these guys are relatively similar technically and physically, but there's a battle going on out there mentally. Nicholas talks about golf as being 85% mental and 15% technical. My friends who golf say, wasn't it amazing that Nicholas came out a few years ago and won the Masters? At 43 years old, technically and physically, he just didn't have it anymore. But mentally, he wanted to show that he was still the champion, that he could still bring it together. Connors makes a statement. He says, and you think about Jimmy Connors, at 36 years old, he's been in the top 10 in the world in his sport for 18 years. I mean, that's a remarkable phenomenon. He says, experience is a great advantage, but by the time you get it, you're too old to do anything with it. The extreme position of this relationship would be with the position right now in Olympic springboard diving, where the coach of the United States Olympic springboard diving team says at the current point at this point in the world, it's 100% zero. And what he's saying is that everybody who can dive at that level is as good as Greg Louganis technically and physically. They're just not Greg Louganis. There's something else that Greg Louganis has. In fact, most people that watched in the Olympics, the people that I talked to diving, Irene McDonald, people that tell me that Louganis wasn't the best diver in the Olympics technically. The Chinese diver was better than Louganis technically, but he brought something else to the situation. I mean, here's a man who in the first round of diving can almost decapitate himself. I mean, it was amazing how many times they played that over and over and over again. He can almost kill himself, and rather than what most athletes would do, which is under those kinds of circumstances, use that as a reason to not compete well. I mean, I'm competing in spite of this. He uses it as a reason to go on and win a second gold. I mean, he never referred to it. He downplayed it continuously. And Louganis is a superb athlete psychologically. It's well known, for example, that he spends 35 to 40 minutes before each dive in terms of doing mental imagery. Hence, the Canadian Diving Association likes now to have its divers do 5 dives beside the pool for every one off the board. So, whatever the figures are, I mean, I don't care. I'll make it 50-50, and then I won't insult anybody. But whatever it is, what I'm going to say simply is that we can provide our athletes with the best technical and physical opportunities, but in some sense we assume that the mental side of it will get dragged along. And we even express this in terms of these kinds of archaic philosophies, like, you know, the sort of survival of the fittest mentality. When the going gets tough, the tough get going. That sort of stuff. And we recognize that what's traditionally happened, in fact, I could suggest that this M that I've got up here for mental could just as well stand for maturity. As you get older, you get wiser, as Jimmy Connors says, or as Arthur Ashe said, when he was 35 and 7th in the world, if I knew at 19 what I know at 35, no one in the world would have touched me. The problem is, I'm 35. So And to take that one step further and just to think about that in a little more depth, I would suggest that for many of you in your sports, you would probably agree with me that the champions in your sport are frequently not the best technical models. They're champions for other reasons. They have evolved idiosyncratic aspects of their performance. They're champions in spite of their flaws. I mean, in my sport, what is the right way to hit a forehand? There is none. There's 1,000 different ways, and the bottom line is outcome, whether or not it goes into the court one more time than your opponent hits it into the court. I think about a basketball player like Larry Bird, who shoots the ball off the side of his head. Is that the right way to shoot a basketball? Would you ever coach that? No, you wouldn't, but he's one of the greatest basketball players of our time. Is Wayne Gretzky a great skater? They tell me that he's not, but he's certainly a great hockey player. Is Joe Montana a great passer? He's not a great passer. He can't throw the long ball anymore, but he's a great football player. I was at a sports psychology conference a couple of years ago, and a man named Richard Schonborn spoke. He's the fellow who discovered Boris Becker, the young German tennis player, who won Wimbledon at 17 years old. And one of the things that people commented on was not only how skilled Becker was technically, but how mature he was mentally. And I said to Schonborn, you know, Becker must be a superb athlete to work with. And he said he is. He's a remarkable young man. But he said, you just think about Borg, who some people suggest was probably the finest athlete physically to ever play sport. He had a resting heart rate of 33 beats a minute. And the comment was made, he said, you think about Borg. When Borg was 17 years old, he won the French Open. The French Open is played on clay. It's a very slow surface. And he won because he was in superb condition physically. In fact, Borg used to say, my greatest virtue is patience. I'm willing to stay out there longer than anybody else. And the last time he won the French Open, he beat Ivan Lendl in 5.5 hours. But clay favors a slow court player. It favors the kind of person who's willing to stand in the baseline and hit ground strokes, forehands and backhands. When Borg was 17 and he won the French Open for the first time, people said he'll win the French Open many times, but he will never win Wimbledon. And the reason he won't win Wimbledon is because he can't serve and volley. And Wimbledon is on grass, and grass is a fast surface. It favors the Beckers and the McEnroes, the serve and volleyers. Well, it's interesting that Borg never learned to volley. He never did learn to volley. He worked on his serve, and he also won Wimbledon 5 times before he retired. He won the French Open 6 times as well, but he won Wimbledon 5 times. And what Schonborn was saying simply was that this man brought something to his sport which was greater than the technique of his physical presence. It was ability to simply go out there and say, this is what I do. I'm going to do this to the best of my ability, and if you can beat me, then you're a better player than I am. In fact, I'm going to go so far to suggest something which is quite obvious, given what I'm saying, which is that without mental toughness, you can't ultimately be successful despite all of the technical and physical skills in the world. You will become a frustrated athlete. But with mental toughness, I think one can overcome technical and physical deficiencies and limitations to become a champion. And I think sport is full of those kinds of people. In fact, my sense of it is that sport is littered with fallen athletes who are somewhat mistakenly described as having great potential or having had great potential. And when you ask a coach what he means by that, he talks in terms of technique. He says, this person technically had it. And my sense of it is that that's not an important issue. My sense of that is almost that that's time. That's commitment and time. And if someone was to come along and say, that person had it together mentally. If only we've been able to provide them with the technical and physical training, they could have been a champion, then I'd say that, to me, has a lot more to do with potential. And in fact, I guess if I was going to think about how we might select athletes, if we ever got to that point, those would be the kinds of things I think we might want to look for. Not the people that have got the money to buy the lessons and all that sort of stuff, but the people that have got the guts and the ability to cope with stress. In my experience of working with athletes, in fact, I can tell you that often the technically athletes are the poorest athletes mentally. And the sense of it is that they've never really had to work hard at some level. That they've been able to, that's often an implication of developing too quickly in the technical realm. And that may be also in the physical realm. The athlete's just bigger than other people. Is that when it actually comes down to the end of it all, when they start to grow up in their sport, they actually have a lot of problems because they've never had to invest time in the mental training. Whereas the less skilled athletes are often extremely tough mentally. And by the time they get to the peak of their sport, when the technical and the physical stuff has filled in, then you really have potentially a very fine athlete. My frustration then is what I call the search for the technical grail, that somewhere out there is perfection, and that people continue to search for perfect technique. And my sense of it is that in most sports it doesn't exist. There are different ways of doing it. And I'm sort of in favor of saying, let's back off a little bit. Let's assume that with a basic level of competence, skills training in terms of proper technique, that will fill in over time, and application and dedication, and that the more important thing is to learn how to use those skills effectively when they come into place. And I think the thing that we can recognize, if we look at world-class athletes, although we may say they're not the best athletes technically, and some of them have physical problems, one of the things that we do recognize by their success is that they are usually superb athletes psychologically. One of the things that's really important to me in talking about this is the recognition that we're talking about psychological skills, not talents. We're talking about a learning process. And of course, that means there's hope left for all of us, in the sense that maybe we could just say we haven't learned. There's been some deficiencies in our learning. I'm saying simply that mental toughness is a learned skill. People aren't born with it. People are not born mentally tough. They learn to be mentally tough. My sense of working with some 4,000 or 5,000 athletes over the last 6 or 7 years is that clearly people come to your sport with differing levels of ability to cope with stress and competition. And the best expression of that I can find so far in a 15 or 16-year-old athlete is parenting. What kind of parents that child's had, what kind of parents, what attitudes that parents have towards the development of issues like competence versus competition, things I'll talk about in a little while. But given that athlete then at 15 or 16 years old decides to take up the sport, I think we can work with that. We can work with that athlete. I get very concerned when people say, that's just the way I am. I'm just that kind of person. I just sometimes lose control or whatever. I just sometimes quit. That's just the way I am. My sense of it is that in the same way that people learn behaviors which are not adaptive, they can learn behaviors which are adaptive. And that's never to imply that it's not difficult. In fact, I think it's a very difficult process. So we're talking about psychological skills training. And I think that we're saying that we talk in terms of packages. We talk in terms of things like, in the same way we talk about technical and physical skills, we talk about things like pre-competition and competition training, arousal, activation, modification, imagery training, cognitive restructuring, goal setting, behavioral skills, and I'm going to talk about some of those this evening. One of the things that's frustrating for me as well is that for some reason people don't seem to assume that mental training requires practice, that you can kind of conjure it up on the day of the meet. It's sort of like I have this feeling as a psychologist working with athletes when people come to me that they have a feeling that what they're going to do is get down on their hands and knees and put their hand on their forehead and sort of zap out the anxiety. It'll go away and then they'll be all right, and that's all there is to it. Because we've got a society which kind of looks for those kinds of instant cures. And one of my big frustrations is that I have met very few athletes over whatever, this 6 or 7 years. Very few coaches that don't agree that mental training is important. But I've met very few athletes that do it. Very few. I know very, very few psychologically skilled athletes. In the same way that they are technically and physically prepared, they're just not as prepared psychologically. So the big issue then is that it requires practice. You have to practice in exactly the same way that you practice technically and physically. You have to train. You have to train in the mental realm. In fact, according to Al's models, you should be able to take a bit of time off because you're taking the technical stuff to such an extreme now. You're getting tired out, so you can cut back on that stuff and spend the time on mental training. As Terry Orlick says in his work with the Olympic programs, psychological training should become a part of the training package for young athletes. And one of the things that's important there is that we need to build in what we could call criteria for compliance or adherence, making sure that people do it. My sense of working with some of the best athletes in this country who are, say, in their early 20s, is that most of them are playing psychological catch-up. They're athletes that have got to the point where they become international athletes, at least in terms of most of their preparation, and suddenly they realize that they should be doing better than they are, and they suddenly want to invest in psychological training. I think the real exciting stuff is this stuff right here. I work with the Canadian Davis Cup team. I consider that a wonderful privilege in terms of their tennis program. They're wonderful athletes. They're great young guys, and I've worked with some of them for a considerable length of time. I have to tell you that I think it's far more important to work with the grassroots movements of the Tennis BC program and work with the 12 and the 13 and 14 years old, because by the time that those kids get to be 19 and 20, they're going to be there. They're not going to get to 20 years old and say, gee, what's wrong? What's missing? What have I left out? So that in some sense, psychological training becomes most important with young athletes, developing athletes. In fact, I'll present a little bit further on, I guess, the serious implication, which is that if it's not done, most athletes don't continue in sport. They leave it. In fact, just to follow up on that, the word burnout is a word that we use a lot today. Burnout is a psychological phenomenon. It's not a physical phenomenon. It's the thing of where people experience sort of a lack of emotion. Their emotions are no longer invested in what their emotional exhaustion. They experience depersonalization. They kind of become distant from the people that they're doing with. And they begin to feel inadequate in terms of what they do. They say, maybe I shouldn't have taken up this sport. Maybe I shouldn't have taken up this job. And that burnout is a very real phenomenon. It's interesting to note that 70% of sports dropouts, and we're talking about young athletes, indicated that it was the competitive aspect of sport that caused them to leave. What that's implying simply is they're not prepared to deal with stress, the stress of competition. I mean, I'm not saying that competition is bad, but if it causes unhappiness. See, I would sort of suggest that people should be doing sport for the best reason, which is that they enjoy it. And my sense of most world-class athletes is that they enjoy sport, and my sense of it is with most very young athletes that they enjoy sport, and that somewhere in the middle, something happens for most athletes, which is that it ceases to become enjoyable. There's something else that creeps in there. In fact, I think the challenge is for many of you is how many young athletes that you work with or over the history of being a coach that you looked at when they were 12 years old are still doing their sport when they're 18 years old. Not many in many sports. I'm always dismayed how many, when you find out that somebody who was being described as a potential Olympic athlete 2 years later on has given up the sport for a very good reason. They weren't enjoying it and they decided to go out with girls instead, or she decided to go out with boys. I think what we have to recognize is that competition is stressful, and as part of this we want to teach stress management techniques. We want to prepare athletes for what will be a stressful situation. Have to let people realize that it's not bad to feel anxious, nervous before a competition, that it's normal and it's characteristic of a championship athlete. Jimmy Connors says, if I don't feel nervous before a competition, there's something wrong. It indicates that I'm not taking it seriously. It means that I've downplayed the competition, and I've got to look for something to get me excited. But we run around, telling people, don't get nervous. It'll be all right. You'll just do fine. I think we should be saying, hey, it's great you're nervous. Now, how are you going to deal with that? And what are you going to use? What are you going to use that energy for? So what's different about our time, at least in the sense of the psychological training right now, is that I think that we've seen a recent interest in psychological training, and that we've now begun to articulate strategies that many athletes have used for a very long time successfully. There's no question that athletes have used strategies like cognitive restructuring or managing self-talk or imagery for the history of sport. I mean, I think about, some of you probably won't remember this, and if you do, you're of a previous generation. We one time had a young woman in this province who was the best swimmer in the world in her divisions. Her name was Elaine Tanner. And Elaine Tanner talks about using mental imagery when she was training throughout the world. And she talks about it in the sense of relaxing somewhere in a hotel in East Germany or wherever it was, and then going through a sequence of imagining herself compete. And she talks about how real it was, how her body moved with it, and how she really got into the muscles. And she could feel herself climb up onto the starting block and hear the crack of the gun and feel the rush of the water, the cold water on her body, and feel her muscles churn as she moved through the pool, and hear the roar of the crowd and feel her hand touch the back of the pool and then move back down. It was in real time. And she'd go through it over and over and over again. That was 22 years ago. And you say to her, did you ever talk to anybody about it? And she said, no, I thought people would think it was kind of strange. Now that kind of imagery is exactly what Greg Louganis does before every dive, or what you saw Karen Percy doing in preparation for the downhill 2 days ago when she stood at the top of the downhill run at Lake Louise, and she closed her eyes and went back and forth like this. She's doing her mental imagery, and at that point she is as if transported into the situation. It's like Bulau, the ski jumper, saying it's a wonderful experience to stand at the top of a 90-meter ski jump and know that you've already made it 30 times today. And here goes number 31. So that we're taking strategies that people have used and we're now articulating, and I think the exciting thing is we can make them available to all young athletes, all developing athletes in a mental package in the same way that we make technical and physical packages available. So the first process then, the first part of this process I think is an educational process, because if you ask people what they think about sports psychology, it's interesting that most people today, if you say, what do you think a sports psychologist does? Most people today still say, well, that's the kind of guy who will help you psych out your opponent. He'll teach you strategies to help you psych out your opponent. Now, I use it all the time in my own competitive situation. I try to use these strategies. They don't work. But But that's not what I do. What I try to do is help people deal with those kinds of situations when other people do that to them. And so the first process simply becomes a process of education, that you need to educate people as to the possibilities. In fact, in the stress management literature, we say the first step in change is awareness. You have to create awareness. You have to create the sense of this is what I could do. The next stage would be acceptance. You either decide that it is or is not something that's important to you. If we look at many of our, say, in our healthcare behaviors, we decide that they're not important. It's okay to go on smoking despite the evidence. But if we decide that it is all right, that it's something we're going to accept the evidence, then we can take responsibility for changing. So that in that same way, we can say to an athlete, now that you're aware of these issues and you think about them, how do you feel about working on this and accepting some responsibility for your own behavior? A very crucial part of that is clearly the coach. I mean, my sense of it is, and I'll come back to this again, but the coach is absolutely fundamental to this process. How long does it take to become a psychologically skilled athlete? Well, in 1983, the United States Olympic Committee brought together 11 of the country's best psychologists to Colorado Springs to plan a psychological program for their athletes in the U.S. Olympic program. One of the first things that they said was, this is 1983, and we sure as heck hope you don't mean 1984. In Los Angeles. We really hope that what you're talking about is 88 in Korea, because 1 year is not enough time. We're talking about 4 or 5 years. Why should we assume that that athlete who spent 4 or 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 years becoming technically skilled, physically skilled, should now just be able to sit down in a week or so and become a mental giant? It just doesn't happen that way. And that's what I say. That's why I say that I think it's very exciting that we see maybe start to move the psychological training into the beginning of sport, because then when that athlete's growing up and they're 19 and 20 years old, they've already had 5 years of psychological training. The other thing about psychological training, mental training, is to some extent I still believe that for most athletes it takes courage to do this. It takes courage to involve yourself in a process which is so obvious to other athletes. I mean, if I say to a young athlete, I think it's really important that in the pre-competition period you try to isolate yourself prior to the competition, either you or your team, and you try to spend about an hour. And during that hour, I'd like you to do some relaxation imagery, some relaxation exercises, some imagery exercises, and then I'd like you to spend about 20 minutes with only one person, and that's the coach. Okay, so that's your hour. And during that last 20 minutes, you and the coach and the team perhaps will read how things are going, and you'll try to figure out if there's anything that needs to be done in that last 20 minutes. That takes courage, because that means in the context of a sporting situation, the youngster says, gee, I got to go on in an hour, I got to disappear. And people say, well, why? What are you doing? Well, I got to go do my mental training. Oh, that stuff's a load of crap. Let's go let's go watch a couple of videos or play some art, whatever. I mean, people don't want to invest time in that. It still takes courage, and I think, we still hear people who talk against it. Right? Because the sense of it is simply that if people don't understand it, they're threatened by it, and they don't want to invest the time in it. They want it almost, it's like, my sense of it is that what happens is people try to actively discourage the athlete from doing it. That's the challenge, to see if you can get somebody out. It's like when your mother went on a diet when you were a kid, and she said she wasn't going to eat dessert. The biggest challenge was to get her to eat dessert. And so when she ate it, you said, I knew you wouldn't do it. I knew you wouldn't. In this process, the process of compliance or adherence, the coach has to take a very active role. I think it's very difficult for an athlete to practice mental training if the coach doesn't support it. Because it really means that the athlete's going to feel isolated. I mean, if that athlete, say, spending that hour before the competition, something like that, I mean, it can even go to creating some conflicts. So that I think that without the coach's involvement, it becomes very, very difficult. And so the sense of it is that we need to have coaches involved in this process. The other side of it, as I'm in talking about courage, is, of course, that people have to recognize that this takes time. That you're investing in something that will take time. And I really believe that that's one of the reasons why people don't comply with psychological training. If somebody comes to me and says, I'm really nervous out there, and I'd really like to be able to learn relaxation strategies, I can say to that person, there's no problem. We can teach you relaxation strategies, and then they'll say, how long will that take? And I say, well, it'll probably take about 4 to 6 weeks, and they say, geez, I'll get back to you. Right? I just got it. And then you see them again, and they say, geez, I really want to get relaxation. And you say, yeah, but it's still 4 to 6 weeks. We haven't come up with anything better. We're working on it. They say, yeah, well, I'll get back to you. And the sense of it is, if you think about it in the technical realm, I could take a youngster out on the tennis court and I can show that person by turning their forehand grip 1/4 turn to the right that they put more topspin on the ball, and the effect is immediate. It's immediate technical change. By the way, I should tell you that for psychological reasons, the likelihood that that youngster will use that forehand in a tennis tournament this weekend is 0. Right? They'll use it in the warm-up, but when it goes back to the match and the arousal levels jump up high, they'll go back to what they've been doing for years, and I'll sit there and pull my hair up. Okay, now, so I think that a coach has to build in cues for compliance. For example, things like the coach's own behavior. Is the coach willing to prepare to be involved in mental training? As I'll talk a little bit just towards the end, I'll talk a little bit about your behavior as coaches. It's pretty important how you behave. But are coaches prepared to spend the time investing in their own mental training? What about things like reinforcing the fact that athletes take the time to do relaxation training, or working on cards with have lists of task-relevant thoughts, observing it, giving input into that process, encouraging monitoring. How many people get an athlete to keep a diary? I think I'd say to all of you, you should keep a diary of technical, physical, and psychological issues. And in that, you should be recording what's happening. What are you doing every day? The use of charts and so on, the sort of stuff that Brent Rushell, who Vic mentioned earlier on, has been so useful in setting up for us, and through the Level 3 theory courses. The pre-competition, competition program forms that athletes can fill out that actually are monitors of what you're doing. You can look at that. I mean, it's very difficult if you're involved in relaxation exercises to get some sense of where you're going, because you live with yourself. But if you look at it and see that you've been practicing it systematically for the last 3 weeks or something like that, and you filled in all those times, you get a sense of where you've come from, and you can actually be recording the levels of relaxation you feel both physically and mentally during that time. What I'm saying here is that I think it's one thing to know about it, and it's another thing to do something about it. And my sense of it is, I go back to this, is that most athletes, most coaches recognize that mental training, psychological training is important. They pay lip service, they recognize that it's crucial, and most people don't do it. They really have this sense of it's kind of like it's something that will come together on the day of the competition. And if you think about that, if you think about the frustration of knowing that there's something that you could do that would help you out and not being able to do it. Just give you an example. The most common fear in the marketplace today is the fear of public speaking. Standing up in front of a group of people just like this and feeling nervous about it. It affects about 40% of us. And the sense of it is, if you think about your own feelings about that, you think about the time that somebody said to you, we'd like you to give a talk. And we talk about approach avoidance conflicts. It's a long way away, so you say, sure. And then as time gets closer, you get a little bit more nervous about it, and as the evening draws before, you decide you're going to practice. So you stand in front of the mirror, and it goes really well. Your spouse thinks it's great. Kids clap, and the dog doesn't leave, so you decide that you're on track. And then you get up in front of the people the next day, and you're standing up there in front of the group of people, and things are just going beautifully, and you're following your notes and so on, and then something happens out there that disturbs you, and suddenly you notice that your back knee begins to shake a little bit, and you can't figure out why that's happening, and you know that Vic over here can see it, so you try to shove your foot through the floor. And that causes the tremor to sort of move up the body. And then maybe you notice that your hands begin to shake a little bit, but we're okay because the body's shaking, but the voice is all right. And then suddenly the mouth goes dry. And there's water nowhere in sight, and you start to experience this incredible feeling called depersonalization, as we call it clinically, where there's this person out here trying to give the talk, and there's something back here watching it happen. And it's sort of saying, why is this happening to me? What's going on here? And you're saying to yourself in a totally task-irrelevant way, relax. Please relax. And you're screaming at yourself to relax. The point is, you don't know how to relax. Now, you know how to relax when you don't have to. The question is, do you know how to relax when you have to? When you're standing up there and you notice a tremor coming up your leg and you think, I'm going to do my relaxation exercises as I'm talking, and you notice the tremor go away and you continue, and it's not a problem. I mean, you think about the number of times that you've said to an athlete, Bob, you got to relax out there. And Bob says, Coach, I'm trying, believe me, I'm trying to relax. And you say, just relax, Bob, and take it easy. I know there's 0 seconds left, and you got to go on the foul line and shoot 2 foul shots, and the score's tied. So relax, Bob. And Bob's saying, Coach, I'm trying to keep my dinner down right now, right? And you say, and you say, don't worry, Bob, just relax. I'm just wondering, if you think about that in terms of outcome versus process, which we'll talk about later on, I'm wondering how, if you might think it would be a little bit more effective to forget about trying to tell Bob to relax, but giving Bob some instructions, saying something like, what I want you to do is to take 4 deep breaths. Put your hand on your stomach and feel your stomach move first. Take 4 deep breaths, full deep breaths, and slow down. Take your time. What Bob would notice, in Al's terms, is that his heart rate would go down and he'd be more relaxed. So what we're doing is giving the person a process strategy as compared to telling him where we want him to be, but we don't tell him how to get there. It's like you when you're standing up in front of that group of people and you really want to relax, but you can't. And in fact, the interesting thing about that is we'll talk a little bit about it in terms of arousal. For all the will in the world, there's not a doggone thing you can do about it, and in fact, will makes it worse. Because you get into the stress spiral phenomenon, and you may be one of those people who actually stands up in front of the group of people and says, I can't go on. I got to stop. And it might be a few minutes, and it might be forever, but I can't go on, right? You just can't talk anymore. But it's not, your motivation is not lacking. So, if you think about athletes from an emotional point of view, if you think what happened, we see 4 kinds of profiles of athletics in terms, emotion in terms of athletes. You think about this. You see one athlete who, in terms of the face of competition, the stress of competition, withdraws their emotion. And sports have different names for it. Some call it tanking. It's a tanking response. I'm not going to continue under these kind of circumstances. The officiating is terrible. I'm quitting. We'll never know how I would have done, but I'm not going to continue. The second strategy is the one where the person loses emotional control in the face of, say, the stress of competition, poor officiating. The person goes crazy, gets angry, and says, I just can't handle it anymore. I lost it out there, coach, that's the way it is, and we'll never know how I will have done, but I just can't handle those kinds of situations. The third profile is the one that I've just talked about, which is that person who truly wants to do well. Their motivation is high, they're committed, they put a lot of time into this, and for all the will in the world, for all that motivation, it's getting in their way. And they're experiencing that response. They're choking, and the words don't come out anymore. The arm doesn't move anymore. This is the same person who in practice does it flawlessly, in competition cannot perform at all. By the way, the fourth profile, and you've all seen athletes like this, and in some sense it's kind of a cognitive flip if you can get a person to do this, because it's not difficult, is that athlete who in the face of the stress of competition perceives everything that happens in that competition as a challenge. I wonder, says Greg Louganis, despite the fact that I just split my head open, I wonder if I can still win the gold medal. And that's the challenge of it all, right? I wonder if despite the fact that the officiating is atrocious, that the weather is lousy, that I wish that it was different than it is, I wonder if we can still optimize our performance. Okay, this guy does this every time. Every time I give a talk, he leaves halfway through it. Roger Skillings and I came here 22 years ago to do a coaching tour for the Tennis BC. I was 10 and Roger was 20. Okay, right, okay. Now, I want to talk a little bit about some of the practical applications of some of the things we, given my frustration, which is rampant right now, I want to talk about some of the things that you can do. Okay. I think that sport competition is essentially divided up into 3 phases: pre-competition, competition, and post-competition. Now, post-competition, of course, is pre-competition unless you're planning to retire. What I want to say about this, I'm trying to think. I've been thinking a few years over, what is the difference in these 3 states? And it seems to me that a really crucial variable. This is a trick to write here. I want you to know that you got to pull this down and write at the same time. Is the issue of control. Okay? There's a psychological difference in the amount of control that an athlete and the coach has over this situation. In pre-competition, you essentially have an enormous amount of control. You have the opportunity to exercise control over your environment. During competition, you share control. You share control with all of the things that make competition what it is: an opponent, conditions, officials, and yourself, all of those things. And to the extent that you can establish complete control, then you will dominate the competition. Okay? You will be successful. And post-competition is an experience, is a situation in which again control is given back to you. You choose whether or not you're going to use it. My concern here is that when I think about this, my sense of it is that most athletes and most coaches renege this control. They don't use it well. What I'm talking about is that situation where a person can come to this line of demarcation, the point between competition and the pre-competition period, and they can know that they are ready. And they are ready because, quite simply, they've taken care of business. And that's a coaching and an athlete-centered issue. I say to athletes, what I want you to do is to create lists of all the details that you've got to take care of in the pre-competition period. Because, quite simply, if you get out there into competition and there's something that gets in your way that you could have taken care of in the pre-competition period, you really don't have anyone else to blame but yourself. For example, I'll give you a couple of examples. Say working with a national wrestling program, 70% of which is centered at Simon Fraser University. One of the things that was brought to my attention by a nutritionist is these guys eat badly, very, very badly. They don't eat well for high-performance athletes and Olympic athletes. Same sort of stuff that Vic talks about in terms of how high-performance athletes don't always do these things. And so these guys were going down to the NIA championships in Tacoma. And one of the things that we talked about was food. What are you going to do over the 2.5 days that you're in the Tacoma Dome? Given that you're going to have to wrestle 8 times, what are you going to do? And so they said, well, I guess we'll just have food there. So we started talking, what's available in the Tacoma Dome? Well, there's hot dogs and hamburgers and chips and pop. And so you're going to be wrestling every 3 hours, and so you'll probably come off of your boat, and exercise is an appetite depressant, so you won't have anything for an hour or two. So about an hour before you go out for your next bout, you'll sit down and have a couple hot dogs and some chips and a Coke. And I'm wondering if you'll have the experience of indigestion out here in the competition. And if you do, my sense of it is that's poor planning. So what these guys did, and they're committed athletes, was they meal planned. And they set it all out, and they put it in baskets, and they took it to the Tacoma Dome with them, and they knew what the impact of the food would be. And by the way, I know that this was responsible for this. For the first time ever in the history of the NIA championships, a non-American school in Simon Fraser won the NIA championships. And I know it was only due to this. I wish. Okay. Whatever it is. I mean, a couple of years ago, about 7 years ago, the BC Lions lost the Western Canadian playoffs. Lost the semifinals to Winnipeg in a game that they were supposed to win. It was held in the BC Dome. Everything was in their favor. They had the best player in the CFL on their team, Mervyn Fernandez. And Mervyn Fernandez he caught 1 pass in the entire game. He had absolutely no impact on the game. He was the Shenley Award winner that year, but he had no impact on the game. Afterwards, it wasn't written up in the Vancouver Sun, but it was revealed that Mervyn Fernandez didn't make it to the game on time. He had a transportation problem. Difficult to imagine on a Sunday morning in Vancouver, but he didn't get to the game on time. He had no warm-up, and he went into the game cold, and he was essentially ineffective. Transportation becomes an issue. I mean, things like rest and sleep and transportation. I mean, I think, for example, you take a group of athletes on a trip, they probably don't sleep that well the night before the competition. But that's not nearly as big an issue if they've slept well for the 3 or 4 nights before they went, when they were at home, and they got extra sleep. Because usually that sleep deprivation isn't going to show up for a day or so. So you start talking about meal planning and transportation and school. People get schoolwork out of the way early in the week so that they're not thinking about it on the weekend of the competition. I got to get home because I got to have an essay ready for school tomorrow, which is going to decide whether or not I get into university or something like that. And so you know, if you to take this one step further, you know, you can think about that time in your life when somebody said to you, "What I want you to do is I want you to work on this task, and when you're ready to do it, let me know." And you work on it, and you work on it, and you work on it, and eventually you get that warm, wonderful feeling of realizing that there's nothing else that you can do. You're ready. And so you say, okay, let's go for it. My sense of it is that's the way you should feel. That's the way you should feel. I talked to one of the best tennis players in the country the other day from Memphis, and he won a match, and then I said, he lost a second-round match. I said, "Grant, what happened?" He said, "I wasn't ready." I said, "You're not ready. I mean, man, what are we doing? I mean, what are we wasting our time for? You're not ready. What does that mean? I mean, what is that? How do you, you know, you've got to be a professional. You've got to start to think about this stuff. So you've got to take care of business. And by the way, I believe that includes that last hour, very importantly, before a competition, right? In that last time, just before competition, I think that's a period in which you really want to spend time with your athletes, coaches and athletes together, to get themselves into this state as much as possible. Now, by the way, I'm not being, in the post-competition period, I think we talk in terms of the 3 R's that you've got to do in the post-competition period, because it does feed back into the pre-competition area. The first one that I would think is that after a competition, at some point, it's important to review your performance, and that's often painful. And you can do that with a coach. And it's often a painful experience, often an emotional experience. But my sense of it is if you don't deal with those things emotionally at that point, then they become blocks for the future. You find yourself in that same situation in a competition, you go, gee, this happened the last time. I wonder if it'll happen the next time. So it's important to work through those things and think about them, and you may get somebody who laughs or cries or whatever, but they've got to work through those things emotionally. You've got to talk about it. I mean, videotape is very useful to that extent. You can actually run it through again. You can play the game again. And people go, oh, I can't believe I did that. I actually did that. I ran the wrong way. I can't believe I did that. But it's important that they sort of work through that. So you review. The next thing you do is you retain. Because as I'm going to suggest later on, the best form of practice is competition. And to the extent that you learn something in competition, you take lessons with you. And a lot of people, of course, will say, you know, you talk about competition, they say, I don't want to think about it, I don't want to know about it, I just want to forget about it. And you say, wait a minute, what is in there, what's in there that you can retain? What are the lessons? What has that competition told you that you can take forward into your pre-competition planning, one aspect of which is practice, for your next competition? The next side of this would be rest. Clearly you have to get some rest, and as many of us say now, one of the most important parts of training is knowing how to rest. It's a very important part of training. And that may be expressed in terms of hours, in terms of a competition, or it may be days, and the recognition that at some point after a rest you have to return, and the concern here becomes psychologically when people come back too quickly or they stay away for too long. So what I'm saying here is that, you know, what you want to do, I think, is try to maximize the control that you have available to you in a competitive situation. I remember, this is a quote I got on a diet. Someone says, a proper diet probably won't make an average athlete elite, but a poor diet can make an elite athlete average. And so those are kinds of things that you can take care of. You can look at those kinds of issues. For example, in Canada, one of the ones that we have which is very unique when we travel is issues like jet lag. You can plan that into a pre-competition program. How will you deal with jet lag when your team travels to Ontario, because that's where the national or championships are this year. Okay, the next thing that I'd like to talk about is, I'll be signing these if you... This is actually the Dave Letterman show. Next thing I'd like to talk about is arousal or activation. And the reason that I think that it's important is that we talk about this is because this is something that coaches can have an enormous amount of input into working with their athletes. And essentially, what I'm talking about is this curvilinear relationship. This is an analogy that exists between performance and activation or emotion. Essentially what this is saying is that there is a curvilinear relationship. As emotion or activation increase, and emotion is nervousness, frustration, anger, fear, jealousy, hatred, whatever it is, as these increase, performance gets better and better and better and better and better and better up to a point, and then right here it starts, if the emotional arousal continues to increase, then performance begins to decrease. It's a very simple analogy, but it has a lot of places for it. Right over here we have the athlete who's asleep. And that's a big problem in some sports. For example, the girl, can you imagine that girl who swam the 5 lakes this summer, fell asleep in Lake Superior? I mean, that sounds to me like sort of life-threatening. But she had a hard time staying awake. Or this is, I don't know, this is Willie DeWitt, for example, you know, struggling for consciousness, or, you know, trying to get back up here get back up into the optimal level there. I mean, in sports, some person gets hit on the head, that's a serious concern. They're unconscious. Over here, I'm not being glib about it. Over here we have the person who's over-aroused. This is the person who's standing in the front of the group and saying, I can't go on. I don't want to say this, but I'm frozen with fear. And this person is unable to continue. Or the person whose anger is so overwhelmed them that they just can't continue anymore. But what a good athlete learns to do is to maximize their level of arousal. And of course this is a sport-specific phenomenon. A sport like golf or target shooting accommodates a very low level of arousal. Then you can slip up, say, into the next realm, say sports like tennis or badminton, slightly higher, playing basketball, slightly higher. And then you can probably go to the optimal one, at least that I can think of, which would be weightlifting. where people just build up over, that whole preparatory period, build up enormous amounts of energy and emotion that they're going to channel into that bar, and they're going to put it up over their head. So it's a sports-specific phenomenon, but clearly, and it also, for any given athlete, it'll fluctuate according to the situation. I mean, for a beginner, there's lower levels of arousal are tolerated, so you got to be careful of that. Beginners can't handle the higher levels of arousal, at least if they're trying to learn the skill, because this is also an important issue in terms of skill acquisition. If you want to teach people skills at the beginner's level, you got to keep the levels of arousal down, and it'll climb up as a person becomes an intermediate and advanced athlete. Advanced athletes can usually tolerate higher levels of arousal. Now, okay, so the trick then is recognizing, and this is what I think we have to build into people, is the sensitivity to know when they are one way or the other. What I'm going to suggest is that for most people, the biggest problem is over-arousal. Being here and not knowing what to do about it. This is the person standing giving the public talk, and they get into the stress spiral, and their very efforts to control it makes it worse. For some athletes, the problem is the problem of under-arousal. They need to build up their energy, they need to focus, they need to get, whatever it is, to put some emotion into it. One of the best expressions of that is to get physical, to just pump themselves physically, to get the blood churning around. There's some practical implications of this. For example, the pre-game pep talk doesn't make a lot of sense in terms of this model, given that for most athletes, the problem is over-arousal. I mean, this is our friend Bob who's trying to keep his dinner down, and the coach is giving him a pre-game pep talk about, come on, Bob, you're going to go out there and destroy them, and you're going to beat them, and the coach is getting excited. And of course, as we talk about later on, athletes who are highly stressed don't like coaches who are highly emotional. It's hard on them because that's their model. Their model is some guy that's jumping up and down, and they're trying to control themselves. But say in our basketball team, what we might want to recognize is that 4 of our athletes have a problem with under-arousal. They're the kind of people, and that's the importance of being a coach, the recognition of individual differences, that I recognize that 4 of my athletes are the kind of people who generally have a problem getting up for a contest. So I got to spend some time with those people, getting them pumped, getting them psyched before the competition. And I've got 6 athletes for whom over-arousal is a problem. And for those 6 athletes, I got a program where they sit and they do some relaxation exercises in the pre-competition period. Now, one of the things that I want to mention to you, and this is maybe one of the most important things that I can leave with you this evening in terms of this model of arousal, is it seems to me that most athletes have 2 curves of arousal. They look like this. And they are a difference between practice and competition. And what I'm going to suggest simply is that most athletes learn to practice rather than compete. Essentially what I'm saying is that most athletes spend most of their time in most sports practicing rather than competing. And the problem with this is there's a basic psychological law which says that the transfer of learning between 2 situations is directly related to the similarity between the 2 situations. So if practice is an experience which is very different or dissimilar from competition, then the transfer of learning will be very minimal. For this athlete, it's right there. I work with some figure skaters who spend 4 hours a day, 6 weeks to compete for 3.5 minutes. I think that's unethical. I mean, I do. I think they should be learning, because I go watch them train. And I watch them flow across the ice after having a conversation, and they go up and do the triple toe loop, they fall flat in their butt, and they go back and they start it again. And when, in a competition, did anybody ever say, when you make that first mistake, start over again? In fact, my sense of it is the most important part of that routine in a competition will be knowing how to pick yourself up once you've made a mistake and get on with the routine. But that person never experiences that in practice. They only experience that in competition. It's an experience they're not used to. Their arousal level pumps up, and their whole performance falls apart. I mean, if you look at, you think about, some of us remember this with the, we try to forget about it. Say the time you took a driving test or something like that, you went out with your parents, you drove around town and you parked in some places and you bumped a few cars and so on. You had a giggle, should we leave a note, let's not, and so on, all that sort of stuff. And you sort of drove around and you did a few things. You went down a wrong one way and all that sort of stuff, and your mom laughed and so on. And then you said, I'm ready to take the test, right? And you go and you take the test, and you get this guy who doesn't smile, and he doesn't laugh, and he looks pretty serious, and he's got a pad, and he sort of sits up there. And the first time you make a mistake, he sort of writes something down, and you can't see what it is, and so on. And eventually, after 5 or 6 of those, he says, you're shaking, and he says, I think we better head on back to the station, and I'm sorry you failed. And then you go out and you get a real driving instructor. In fact, we've got ads in British Columbia right now based on the fact, those ads that say, isn't it a tragedy that this mother or this father is now going to go out and teach her son or daughter to do the same things that they've learned to do so badly. So what we do is we go out and we learn with a driving instructor who puts you through the same kind of test. In fact, he even knows the course. That's what he's got going for him. And he can take you through the whole course and put you through the same kinds of things that the actual tester will do. So what I'm saying simply is that if we want practice to be effective for competition, then we've got to make practice like competition. And the basic element, emotion that I'm talking about there is intensity. You have to create, in some ways, the same kind of emotional intensity in practice. You have to create the same levels of arousal. So what we're talking about is a situation where these two curves begin to overlap. And you get a huge transfer of learning between practice and competition. Of course, the real dilemma in all of this situation is, as I said earlier on, is that it is my sense that most athletes spend most of their time practicing, not competing. In fact, I have a sense that for some athletes, the only practice for competition they actually get is when they compete. So it occurs about every 2 weekends or something like that. They go out and practice competition, and in between they practice practicing. So what they become is very, very good practicers. In fact, those people are really good sparring partners for the good competitors. Right? No, seriously. Because they're really good at practicing. And the good competitors are out there in practice using these people to get better and better, because these people play way beyond themselves in practice. In competition, their performance drops. In fact, I guess I could say, if an athlete showed any decrement in performance from practice to competition, that says something about the way they practice. It's interesting, for example, to think about how teams talk about in the early part of the season, they're not performing as well as they will later on in the season because they got to get into it. Well, that implies that the preseason practice wasn't very effective. And they've got to get some games under their belt to get some real competition to get things rolling. In fact, I guess the other side of this would be that in terms of my model earlier on, in terms of expectations, one of the tragedies of this model is, of course, we create expectations. Athletes say, and you know that frustration. The athlete says, I don't know why. I don't know what happened today. I played beautifully in practice this morning. I skated tremendously this morning in practice. And what happened? And you got a sad, teary-eyed kid there who's trying to figure out what happened. And my sense of it is that athlete was not prepared. We saw that in the Olympics. I saw this terrible picture of this young girl in the paper saying, what happened? It wasn't like this in Canada. You bet it wasn't like that. And the fact that she wasn't prepared for that was, I think, unethical. I don't think she should have been set into that situation to go through that kind of trauma. I mean, that's the kind of thing that can ruin an athlete for their career. They can say, why do this? This is no fun. Okay, so the challenge then becomes to try to create, in some way, in the practice, emotion. So what do? I think that's where you have to be imaginative. In fact, I guess, like, for example, one of the things that I would say to people is, what I want you to do is create a list of your strengths to your weaknesses in this particular sport. And if, for example, you look at most athletes in practice, they'll practice their strengths most of the time. And they'll make begrudging allowances to the coach. Okay, I'll practice that for 10 minutes, and that's their weakness. My sense of it is, if the true champions take that list, turn it around, and spend most of the time in practice practicing their weaknesses, stay away from their strengths, because they're strengths, and that's how you improve, and that creates a lot of emotion, because when you're practicing your weaknesses, your performance isn't what you hoped it would be. Things like, you look at practices, and depending on the sport, but you look in lots of team sports, when you get people to do drills, people will choose to drill against people who they feel less threatened by psychologically. I don't mind losing to this guy, but I'd never lose to that jerk. Right? And so you watch them. You watch the way they pair up. They pair up with their friends. Because we've worked it out. Bob and I are good friends, and sometimes I win, sometimes he wins, but it's okay. We can talk about it. If I was to lose to that guy, I couldn't handle it. You look at good athletes, and we have a young tennis player come out of Canada, out of British Columbia, Helen Kalesi. When Helen was 11 years old, it used to be tremendous to watch her practice, because she would always practice with the person in whatever setting it was that she liked the least, personally. And she'd just get in there and really fight hard. And it was an amazing thing to watch the way that she would generate emotion in the context of practice. By the way, before I go too far in this, I want to say, and I want to make this very clear, that I don't think that for most athletes this is unenjoyable. I'm not saying that practice should not be fun, but it should be intense. And I think My sense of it is, lots of athletes that I work with, you can look at a group of people in a practice and they're just having a lark. And they're just laughing and having a good time. And you can go up to them and say, how was practice today? Or how's practice going? And say, oh, great. And then you ask them at the end of that 2 hours, how was practice today? And they say, well, we had a good time, but it was a waste of time. And then you go to the athlete that's working hard in practice and you say, how are things going today? And they say, it's tough and I don't have time to talk to you. And you ask that person at the end of practice how practice went today, and they'll say, it was good, really good. I worked hard out there and I feel good about it. It's like you when you made that commitment to run, on every Sunday morning or something like that with some other person, and you stayed out late at night drinking, and then you got home and you didn't get enough sleep, and you wake up and it's pouring rain or snowing, whatever it does, and the person's at your door and you're saying, I don't want to go, and they say, you're going, man. We made this contract. I got a contract right here. It says we run every Sunday at 8 o'clock. And so you're out there, and 2 hours later you come back and you say, geez, I'm glad I did that, right? I mean, that's that sense of learning. You've learned something about yourself. You put yourself in a challenge. So maybe that's what I'm saying. You want to create intensity in practice, create challenges. In fact, I've become so barbaric about this that my model is, barring physical injury, the only time that any person should ever take a practice off is when they really feel like practicing and conditions are fantastic. Take the day off. You've deserved it. Okay? I mean, the person comes in and says, I got a cold, I got a headache, whatever it is, it's raining, and you find yourself thinking, when have you gone to a competition and they've said, look, it's raining and I know you got a cold and you didn't sleep well last night, so we'll come back tomorrow, okay? It doesn't work that way. It doesn't work that way. And in fact, what people, and in fact, I should tell you, my model of champions is given the way the competitive situations that we deal with, my sense of champions is that these are people who deal with less than ideal circumstances best. They're people that look at those situations and challenge, and they're prepared for them because they've practiced under those kinds of conditions. So I would say, when I used to, this kid Grant Connell, he's one of the best young tennis players in our country. When he was 17 years old, he was a real nice guy. And he is a wonderful young guy. He's a tremendous man. But on the tennis court, he used to allow bad calls, and people would they'd hit the ball, and I watched him lose an under-21 BC championship because he refused to call 2 serves out, both of which were double faults and would have given him the champion. I'm wringing my hair, so later on in practice, from then on for about 6 months, I cheated all the time. And I'd cheat all the time, and he'd say, that ball looked good to me, and I'd say, Grant, that ball was clearly out. And he'd get angry and said, now we're starting to get somewhere, because what you got to do is you got to get up there and you got to talk to me about it, and you got to say, okay, I think your call was wrong, and we've got to work through that, and there's a right way to do that, and there's a wrong way to do that, but not to do anything at all is bad. Okay? So look for upsetting situations. Okay, now. Are we okay? I don't have any idea what the time is here. It's not.
Just over 3 hours.
Is it? Come on, Chief. Give me a break. God, the time flies. Now, of course, the other side of this curve of arousal is that you could actually teach a person a strategy to get them down from the optimal level, right? I mean, the other side of it is to teach people relaxation strategies. And I'm going to suggest that I think that we should invest a lot of time in teaching athletes relaxation strategies. That if you take somebody and you do something like Jacobson's progressive muscular relaxation technique, which is a good technique for athletes because it's the one that involves the tightening and the loosening of muscles. It takes about 30 minutes in its first go-round. It's good because it's muscular, and athletes relate to muscles, and you can also, as you're focusing on 16 muscle groups in the body, you can also spend more muscles with those muscles that are sport-specific, the ones that are tighter for any given individual, given the demands of their sport. But what happens is that a person does that. It takes about 30 minutes. After a week or so, they cut out the tensing side of it. It takes it down to 15 minutes. And I think in the National Wrestling Program, I think clearly we've got some guys that can now do in 30 seconds what they used to take about 30 minutes to do. They have trained their body in what Herb Benson calls the relaxation response. And they can effectively call it up through breathing. They can use breathing techniques, and they tell themselves as they're taking in the deep breath to relax or let go or something like that. And their body has been trained in that response. So these are more sophisticated relaxation techniques, and through Victor we're going to make some tapes and the National Coaching Institute or something like that you people could get access to, which would take your athletes through the training involved in progressive muscular relaxation. At another level, I should just mention to you that one of the things that the Steinbrenner group spoke about was that it was interesting to them to note that in terms of inducing relaxation, that what they're saying, well, not many, most North American athletes do not breathe properly in their sport. And in fact, they comment on the fact that in North America, if you want to learn how to breathe properly, never talk to an athlete. Talk to a singer or a musician. They're the only professions that learn breath control, that learn diaphragmatic breathing from the lower gut rather than from the chest. If you watch somebody when they're anxious, they tend to pant. They breathe very quickly from up here, and they go, and in fact, there's a very profound clinical syndrome that we see now. It's a disorder of the 1980s. It's called panic disorder. We didn't even articulate it prior to 1980, and we now see it in general hospitals. It's usually men, sometimes women, in their mid-30s, early 40s, showing up with what they think is heart attack. And they have these symptoms, and this hyperventilation syndrome and tightness in the muscles, and it looks like heart attack. And they get an Ativan, and it goes away. And we have this whole brand of tranquilizers, in fact, like Ativan.